how do we change our systems so that we're more open? And we need diversity in our teaching force, right? Like, we know that the research says that students in our schools need to be able to see themselves represented. And yet it's really hard.
I think that we know there's challenges for all human beings, but the disconnect, I think, for immigrants and newcomers is that there's sometimes a lack of coordination, because you don't know sometimes that resources even exist, right?
One child participant in my dissertation talked about a teacher creating a sense of home for them in the class. She said, "You are one big family. Even if you left this class, you are still part of this, great family."
Welcome, everyone, to the Leaning In and Speaking Out podcast. My name is Michelle Lamb. I'm one of the co-hosts of the podcast. I'm here with Dr. Jackie Kirk, who is the other co-host of the podcast. And I'm really excited today because two of the guests that are here with us are people that I've been working with for a while. So you'll probably be able to tell that from our conversation. We know each other pretty well and work together well. And so I'm expecting some laughs in this conversation and hopefully not too many inside jokes so that you can follow along. But Jackie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Jackie Kirk, and I'm in the Department of Leadership and Educational Administration at Brandon University. And I think I'm sort of the outsider in this project this morning. And so I'll try to make sure that everybody makes their connections between the topics and with each other and keep everything rolling. And I'm really excited about the conversation and really happy to have the two of you on our show today. And so, Enver, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Absolutely. Enver Naidu, great to be here. I feel kind of weird introducing myself since we all know each other. So, but for you folks out in podcast land, I'm the executive director at Westman Immigrant Services. I have background in private and nonprofit sector, and I bring that kind of curiosity and toolkit into the job to really unpack how we can serve the community better. I also have an MBA in community economic development, and I think just bringing that kind of perspective into connecting immigration and economic development as well, so we can build stronger communities.
Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ayodeji Oshiname, and I'm a MyTax Elevate postdoctoral fellow in anti-racism and belonging here at Brandon University CARES Research Center. And this postdoc is in partnership with Westman Immigrant Services here in the Brandon area. And I'm excited to be here this morning. And for those of you who don't know me, I finished my master's degree here at Brandon University before going to the University of Manitoba to complete my doctoral studies. And now I'm back home, and Brandon is home, and I'm happy to be here, and I'm excited.
And Jackie, when you said earlier that you're an outsider to the conversation, you're not really an outsider because you were very involved with Dr. Oshiname's work in the past and present. You're writing.
I was, yeah. Odeji and I do lots of research together. And when he was doing his master's classes and thesis, he was working as my research assistant. So we've known each other for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So I think to start off, let's talk about the work that both of you are doing. And in some of that, maybe trace backwards a little bit so we can understand how these projects came to be. And then talk about how that work supports newcomer settlement, like you said in your introduction, Amber. So, Ayodeji, do you want to start off?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. I finished my dissertation, my postdoctoral work in June of this year, and So my doctoral research is really looking at newcomer families in settling into Canadian society. So for example, the research is about expanding an understanding of home, about how newcomer families, about how they adjust in Canada and how they realize a sense of belonging. And so in that work, my research see home as a connections of a network of connections and how human connections and human relationships are important in realizing a sense of place and a sense of belonging. So when newcomers come from their countries of origin and they come into Canada, first thing they do is to make connections to their countries of origin. They make connections to their families. They make connections to their friends in their countries of origin through social media platforms such as or technology such as WhatsApp, right? And then the next thing they do is they try to make connections to individuals in the diaspora, right? That share similar experience or have been living in the diaspora in Canada for a while, and those connections give them stability to be able to go out and build relationships in the school, in the community, and and that relationship, I believe, are fluid. They're not static as they try to settle in Canada. And that work that that I did for my dissertation, support newcomer families through the understanding that I developed about how newcomers establish a sense of belonging. So in my research or in my work with Brandon University CARES Research Center and Westman Immigrant Services, we're looking about racism and belonging within newcomer population in the Brandon area. And the first study that I'm working on is about employment and credentialing barriers. So when newcomers come into Canada, right, they bring all these skills, they bring all these qualifications, they bring all these experiences. And then when they come to Canada, it's so difficult for them to, to transfer all of these experiences, all of these skills. They can't get a job, they can't get, affordable housing. And that's a challenge, right? And in this work, I'm planning to talk about talk to new immigrant professionals because we're looking at economic class immigrants. Talk about how we can help them interpret, the local labor market, right? And help them to see how they can use their skills and experiences in a better place, right? And then talk to employers of labor as well and how what they need, right, in their organizations as well, and how we can try to move everybody forward, right? And then, of course, I'm working with Westman Immigrant Services. We, as a hub, like to make connections between these groups, between professional level immigrants and then the employers of labor in the Brandon area, and thus to find how we can create opportunities, employment opportunities for newcomers in Brandon.
I think that research is so needed. And this is just my own anecdotal talking to people in the community, but we have employers who are talking about labor shortages and saying we can't find enough people. And that's not just Brandon, that's Manitoba. Maybe you'll talk more about this, Amber. But then I know about newcomers who are saying, well, I got recruited to Canada because I got a lot of points for my background, skills, and qualifications, but I can't get jobs in those areas. And so there's a huge disconnect there.
Right.
And so I think your research fits a really important gap.
Absolutely, Michelle. It's important. We need, like you said, we have a lot of labor shortages and we have all this human capital out there, right? We need to be able to find ways to, to involve or to help move our community forward, right? And I think it's an important work.
So same question over to you, Enver, about the work you're doing and how it supports newcomers.
Maybe before jumping into the question, maybe I'll kind of talk a little bit my journey of how I got into this work. And if it's not relevant, feel free to delete it.
Sorry.
But I entered the settlement sector, which is kind of the work that takes place on the ground, starting up in a role called the local immigration partnership. And through that's kind of how you and I met. And I kind of remember that day. It was I was sitting in a coffee shop. This was kind of during COVID, specific social distancing in place. And I'm trying to share with you this project, which is new in the community. And local immigration partnerships at the time existed in about 85 communities across Canada. And it started out in Toronto, I think in the early 2000s, and it's funded through Immigration, Refugee, and Citizenship Canada. And the role and goal, in summary of local immigration partnerships, is to identify gaps in the community that immigrants and newcomers are facing, and then thinking about which stakeholders can we bring together to address this from a leadership level, and then also ensuring that we incorporate the voices of immigrants and newcomers in that work. And I think it was month 2 in that position. There was some unfortunate challenges that Canada was facing around racism. Now, obviously, we know racism has been around for a long time, but there was a media focus on it, and there was community focus on it, and Brandon as well had an unfortunate incident that was highlighted by the media as a race attack,
Hate crime.
hate crime. Thank you. And being new in that role and building all these community partnerships, there was interest from outside of the community in developing some kind of voice around this. And I wasn't sure whether I should be the one leading that kind of conversation. And I reached out to Michelle and I reached out to other stakeholders and said, look, is there a way we can create a platform to bring together the community and really think about how do we evolve this from a narrative to a way that we can understand where we are and potentially find a way to guide the community through this, so we're not staying with this narrative. And then out of those conversations, we started a project called Community Voices Anti-Racism. And I know you probably have lots of research on your website, Michelle, about this, so I won't get into the details on the findings. But what that identified is that there's definitely a need to keep these conversations going, a platform like Community Voices to bring together different stakeholders, and then obviously having the UK's bringing in that research component to ensure that we have sort of this community engaged research perspective, so it's not just opinions, but it's informed through research. And out of that, we've got one project, and then I think now, sitting with Ayodeji, we kind of have another project that we were able to move forward, and this also started with just an idea. And I think when I moved out of that particular role into my current role as executive director, and I remember being, I think it was like week 1 on the job, and Michelle reached out and said, look, there's this MyTex grant. And we know out of the response from the initial community voices, we know there's an interest in this type of dialogue at the community level, and then we weren't sure how to connect this, right? Like at the time, labor market shortages at the scale that it's at, not just in Brandon, not just in Manitoba, not just in Canada, but globally. I think out of the pandemic, like we had no clue that this was going to be as topical as it is now. And then, but we submitted the application, and I think it was a year later we found out we were successful. And so, I think if it was, if we look back, I think the timing of things, was certainly submitting the application and now having the project come to light, the timing of things just worked out perfectly. And then also having you here, Deji, with your research, but also your passion and your interest, and just your lived experience as well. I think it's the culmination of all that, and obviously the network and the relationship you have now allows us to kind of move forward these conversations a little bit more easily, because we have this pre-established platform around community voices, and now we've got connected through equity, diversity, and inclusivity. But we're also trying to ensure that there's that community engaged perspective. How do we move this research forward into the community? And we've connected it to barriers to employment. So the ability for me personally to be part of this movement, because I really see it as a movement, that maybe we start here and share with others, is quite timely. And so that kind of where we come from, but where I am today, a little bit the work we're doing at Westman Immigrant Services. I think when we think about newcomer settlement specifically, we tend to use the word newcomer like this homogenous group, and all newcomers need the same supports. And I think this is one of the things that I'm trying to explore, is unpacking and really looking at this through a segmented approach. Because depending on what pathway you came to Canada, your needs might be very different. Depending on some of the barriers you may have, your supports might be very different. And then even within that, you may bring family members later, and your needs and their needs might be very different. And so, as we unpack and repack that, we're starting to explore new programs, new services. We're starting to also try and think about giving those a voice that don't necessarily have a voice, because just because there isn't program funding for specific segments of the newcomer population, doesn't mean that there aren't needs. And so as an organization, we've been very proactive, and then we not doing it alone. We have great partnerships, and then we also want to shift from it being opinion to really ensure that there's some assessment and some best practices that we can establish along the way that could better inform the work we do, but maybe also help support the settlement sector at large. So I think part of what we do now, to answer your question, the work that we're doing is really, the good work has been happening for years. But what we're doing differently right now is we're not making assumptions. We're unpacking and repacking to see, is what we're doing working? Is there another way to do it better? And are there gaps that we can also support other stakeholders in the community? Because immigrants and newcomers don't live in a vacuum. And at what stage do they stop being immigrants and newcomers? So it really comes back to my initial introduction about building a stronger community. And it's taking this broad perspective of who immigrants and newcomers are.
Thank you. Ayodeji, sorry,
Okay.
let me try that again. Ayodeji, maybe following up on that, maybe you'd talk to us about some of the strengths that newcomers bring with them when they come to the community.
Thank you, Jackie. In my conversation, I've talked about the many strengths, the experiences, the skills that newcomers bring into this great nation, right? They fuel, they drive the sociocultural, right? The diversity, linguistic diversity in our communities, right? They bring so many things like adaptation, resiliency, high hopes. They bring aspirations, right? They bring so many human capital into this great country. Most of them are hardworking, right? And all of these qualities, I think we need to emulate, in our communities, in our country. And finally, I want to say that newcomers, they fill in the economic and demographic needs in Canadian society. As we know, the population is aging, right? And we need to bring, people that can help us with economic stability, and people to pay taxes, people to help support programs. And I'm not saying that's the only thing newcomers bring. They bring so many things, but we need to consider that as a factor as well, right? And Yeah.
Thank you. Anything that you guys want to add?
Go ahead.
Sure. I think it's somewhat of a polarized question because we saying, we really focusing on newcomers and what they bring, but I think on the other side of it is like which I did you touched on. I think as a country we need population growth, right?
Mhm.
But then we look at it at sort of at a at a micro level, like there's family reunification, there's humanitarian needs, there's a lot that needs to be explored. And so when we think of strengths, depending on who you're talking to, it's going to be fairly broad response. And I think there needs to be sort of an opportunity to kind of explore what strengths look like at the family level, at the community level, at a national level, and provide an avenue for all of those types of strengths to kind of come forward. And one very simple example. I mean, you could be here in Canada and thrive in whatever lifestyle you living in, but if you have concerns about family members in your country of origin, and that ability for unification isn't there, or just there may be some challenges, and we don't think about that, and we don't create opportunities for support at a community level, then we kind of neglecting to think about supporting that individual, and then eventually strengths become weaknesses. And part of that consideration is just that when you're new to a country or new to a community, you don't have the same support you had if you were established in the community, if that's the community you lived in, if that's the community you were born in. So you may not necessarily have the same ties to getting whether it be social or emotional support or even financial support. So if we don't think about some of the challenges individuals are going through, and we make these assumptions that just because somebody arrived with strengths, and not try and think about like where could some of the gaps be, we may miss out on supporting them long term, and that could be a disservice to them, and then obviously a loss of opportunity for us at the community level as well.
Good point.
I really appreciate that point. I remember reading something about, I think it was a critique of the point system for immigration or something like that. And someone was saying like, my grandmother doesn't receive very many points in the chart of how many points are worth for education or language, etc. But my grandmother is what holds my family together. And so I really appreciate that point about thinking about people in a more holistic way and thinking about communities in a more holistic way. That's really important.
And let's go back then. I think that again, it's a fairly polarized conversation, because when we talk about one group, it doesn't mean necessarily we're not talking about another group. And but I think that there needs to be an opportunity to kind of have this sort of cross section of when we talk about strengths, what strengths are we talking about? We know there's a shortage of daycare. And you just mentioned grandparents as an example. And I mean, that plays a strong role to supporting the family, and then it plays a strong role to supporting the economic strengths of that family unit, so that they can pay for the kids to go to summer camp, right? And so we don't necessarily think of it through that lens sometimes in policy, but we're hoping things work out, and I think that there should be some more conversation around that.
Yeah, we see the bigger pictures, but not the details and the nuances, and that's really an important piece. And I think we're starting to realize that, like, I hear more of the conversations about the supports that newcomers need to have, but it's a slow process, I think, before we get that sort of into our mainstream of our communities. So you talked a little bit about it, but why don't you just keep going with that conversation about the challenges that newcomers face? Like, you started into that. Do you want to carry on? Is there more that you have to say about that?
Oh, there's a lot more.
I thought so.
I think I want to preface this by utilizing the term newcomers and expanding on it, because because if you arrived, if you came through family reunification and the grandparent and you arrived in Canada, and if English isn't your first language and if French isn't your first language, and so you're not speaking one of the two official languages, there's some significant barriers. And maybe you were very independent in your country of origin and you arrive here and now you can't drive. Like the quality of life for you looks very different, right? And then the vulnerability that may come with that. So those challenges is very distinct from somebody who maybe arrived here as an international experienced professional, and maybe in Manitoba we have 31 regulated professions, and there's a good chance before you arrive that it's a regulated profession and you're not going to be able to enter that particular career path. But when we think about those challenges, I've seen even individuals go through the significant expense and time to get their regulations equivalent to Canadian standards, and they are also having challenges finding employment. And so, I think that we know there's challenges for all human beings, but the disconnect, I think, for immigrants and newcomers is that there's sometimes a lack of coordination, because you don't know sometimes that resources even exist, right? And for us as an organization, we certainly within the work that we do, we are that conduit, that bridge, that advocate to try and provide all that coordination, that support, that direction, the program delivery, the services. But a big part of it comes down to funding, and it's the nature of the work that exists. So we come back to this idea of the grandparents, right? There isn't traditionally funding at this stage specifically for immigrant and newcomer seniors. And does it mean there's programs and services? Absolutely, we do have them, and we in partnership are looking to expand on them. But this was a proactive approach, and I don't know if it exists across Canada. And when we think about international experienced professionals, there are processes, everybody will talk about it, that you can go to get your regulations, you can get your designation assessed, and from a Canadian equivalency perspective. But then we're making these assumptions that just doing that is going to lead you to get the career path that you want. And there's a disconnect there as well, right? Which is why the work that Ayadeji is doing around equity, diversity, inclusivity, specifically related to barriers to employment, is going to be so important. Because even if we think about international students as an example, again, really looking at the segmented approaches in terms of who newcomers are. These are individuals who are coming in to Canada. They now they require some level of English language proficiency or French language proficiency. They've got the Canadian equivalent of education because they're attending post-secondary institutions, but they are also struggling as well to get that meaningful employment. And so we've seen that employment tends to be a little bit of a common denominator when it comes to some of the core challenges. And I think why is this important is that that the very definition of settlement is going to look different depending on what your needs are at the time. But in order to maintain a quality of life that's going to support you and your family, employment is sort of a core pillar of that. And so regardless of whether you come into Canada as a refugee or you come into Canada as under an international student mobility, or you come in as international experienced professional, at some point in time, if that barrier or that challenge isn't addressed, you may find yourself in a survival job. And then there's more challenges that come with that, which I'm happy to talk about. But as you can see, there is no one silver bullet for this. I think the key thing that we're trying to do is with the work is to start asking questions. Because if we make these assumptions, and particularly when we use the word newcomer, it's a very dangerous word to use, because then we're saying that the solutions that's provided for newcomers applies to all newcomers, which it doesn't. Right. And then also who's not been referenced in that conversation when we use the word newcomers is. And if the research is around newcomers and employability, then we may not be thinking about the grandparents in that conversation. And then we and I know it's challenging from a research perspective because there's always the research question and we want to stay in scope and things of that nature. So I think that's where these kinds of partnerships, where we have, the academic and the practitioner coming together, because we obviously want to try and move the needle on some things. But the advantage of these partnerships is that we're not forgetting about others. And so it leads opportunity for future research and leads opportunity to move the work forward at the same time.
Thank you.
Jackie, I saw you nodding along in a big way when he was talking about the students that are
Well,
not getting jobs. Do you have something you want to say?
And I've grown a lot, right?
Mhm.
I've been working with international students since before Deja came, and I've watched over time what's happened to them. And I think at the beginning, I always thought about we should bring them. It's an opportunity. Like if I was applying, to a foreign university and they gave me the opportunity, it would be a great learning opportunity no matter what happened. But then as I have had more experience with it, I saw that they weren't necessarily always being successful in our programs when they came. And we've then moved into trying to give them more support to be successful in our programs. But then I see that when they get to the end of the program, they can graduate with a master's degree in Canada and still maybe not get appropriate employment, like employment that would match their level of education. And then I don't know where that takes me back to. It makes me feel really sad. But every year when we face the applications and decide who should come into the program, I go through like quite an emotional time of trying to decide if it's the right thing to give them the opportunity or not, because maybe it's not an opportunity, maybe it's a dead end. And I feel really uncomfortable with that and sort of not knowing what to do, because I know that we can sort of support them through the program, but they expect more than that. They expect that once they have a Canadian degree, they'll be able to get a job in Canada. And I just, in education, we see lots of that. We had a student in our program who he had done his undergraduate degree in education at U of M, and he came to us to do his master's degree. And after his master's degree, he was still working as a teacher assistant, an educational assistant in his school system. And it's just really hard to figure out how do we get from, how do we change our systems so that we're more open? And we need diversity in our teaching force, right? Like we know that the research says that students in our schools need to be able to see themselves represented. And yet it's really hard to hire.
Firstly, I want to commend you for just that, the comment that you made about how hard it is, being, reviewing those applications, because you've seen some of the challenges and you want to ensure that if international students are coming, that they've been set up for success. And I think that's where, giving a voice to those that don't have a voice becomes really key. Because when we look at the research, the majority of international students who do come to Canada want to stay after graduation. But when we look at the program delivery, in the settlement sector, if there isn't funding available for international students to support them, to address some of the gaps that we've spoken about, then they've been left, at least at the community level, to figure things out on their own. At least from an employment perspective, to figure things out on their own. And when I stepped in this role, we saw that gap, and we started knocking on doors of funders to say, look, we need to address this gap. Unfortunately, we were able to get funding, but it shouldn't be so reactive, right? I think there needs to be a commitment, and this is my opinion, a commitment that if we're going to be bringing people into or allowing individuals to come into the country, then knowing that they want to stay and knowing, they've been identified as a population group that could support our immigration growth in Canada, then I think we need to be more proactive to think about what some of the gaps are that's not supporting them. And one of the things that I think of, and I think Ideji touched on this in your introduction, which was awesome. But if there was a summary I had to put on it, it was around institutional actors. And when we think about immigration, immigration is at the federal level, education is the provincial level. And at the community, you've got us, the settlement sector. And if we're not talking to each other, and if we're not thinking as institutions, how do we, we could talk about international students, but we can really apply this to other segments of the immigrant newcomer community. If we're not thinking as institutions, how do we come together? Because it's not going to be up to one institution. And how do we collaborate and how do we coordinate and to better support individuals when they come into the community? Then we hoping one institution takes care of it, right? Or we, at the very worst, we're saying it's not my job, and then that's a disservice to individuals. And I think that isn't unique to Brandon or Manitoba or Canada, because institutional actors and just the way immigration flows and the way education is governed, this is a challenge, and there's lots of research to show that international students are facing the same struggles across Canada. And so I think one of the things that we can do is really think of them as human beings first, who are in the community. And then take a little bit of a segmented approach, because if you came in as an international student and this is your undergraduate degree, I know you mentioned master's, but it was your first degree, maybe your experience is similar, and I'm not saying exclusively the same, but maybe similar to other undergraduate students. But what we've seen is some international students are coming in, bringing their families, right? And what supports are available for them, and especially at that master's level, right? And their needs might be a little different, and most likely a lot different. But when we use this term international students, we kind of not thinking about it at the institutional levels, and we're thinking, well, we have services for international students on campus or off campus or out in the community, but is it supporting the international student base that is in your community right now? And we're not asking those questions, and that's kind of what's exciting. I see this type of work, this type of conversations, is going to allow us to at least have a better understanding, and hopefully be able to support that, in terms of from the work that we do, to then take that research or take that understanding and then go to various stakeholders and say, look, changes are needed, or let's do more of the same.
So just keeping with that theme of education, and I want to ask Ideji, because you've lived this, what they're talking about, and also as somebody who's really embedded in the field of education. So maybe speaking about it from your own perspective, or perhaps speaking about it in terms of the question, what do teachers or educators or administrators need to be thinking about in relation to this topic?
Thank you, Michelle. I'm just gonna, give us a little bit of statistics, and 2016, according to 2016 census, close to 22% of the population were foreign-born immigrant and refugees, right? And also the first and second generation of immigrant children are predicted to be between 39 and 49% by 2036. And also recent news releases by the Minister of Immigration talking about bringing 1.5 million immigrants by 2025, I think. We need the increasing diversity in our schools, right? Need urgent attention to supporting this group, right? And like from my own experiences, right? Oh, let me quickly talk about research, right? And I think Jackie mentioned a little bit about that. research talk about when students see people like them in the school, right? And when all these immigrants see somebody like them, as a teacher in the school, as a support staff, right? They tend to, do well. Several important factors has been identified in the research, right? Things like the importance of building welcoming and inclusive environment for these students in the school, right? And also recruiting staff like that, you know, uh, 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 can support the student, and also culturally responsive teaching is important as well in the school. And from my own research, right, my dissertation, talk about simple and practical ways to build relationships, right, or to make a difference for these children in the school. So in my research, children talk about sport. Sport bring people together. It's a universal language. You don't need to communicate to play, for example, a game of tag, like soccer. We don't need Soccer is universal. People play soccer all across the world, right? And I think soccer brings people together, and adults should see or try to, use that to bring, had youth and children together. And I think that will help in building that welcoming and supportive environment in our schools.
When I think sports brings people together without language, right? Like,
Right.
despite language, I guess.
Mhm.
And I think that's important. I think we get broken down in our relationships through language barriers because we rely so heavily on language for communication. And it's interesting that the children pointed that out, because I think often the adults, I think we tend to think of bigger, more complex solutions. And I like that sort of simple,
Yeah,
practical.
meaningful ways,
Mhm.
and I think adults should try to encourage children to play together, and that will make a difference for them in school. Also, from my dissertation, I think teachers are already doing great job in schools. I think so. One child participant in my dissertation talked about a teacher creating a sense of home for them in the class. She said, "You are one big family. Even if you left this class, you are still part of this, great family." And then she said, "Oh, she's like the mom of of the family." And I think creating welcoming and inclusive environment where children can feel realize a sense of belonging, realize a sense of comfort is important for educators, administrators to think about, because with a lot increased diversity in our schools, right? We need to, articulate a clear goal, a clear vision for how to bring, how to include, this group, and I think it is important. So I just want to highlight in my own experience, like Michelle asked me. So for me, it was intentional connections that I made with the mainstream Canadians that made a difference for me. I was working at BUKS as a research assistant with Jackie and Mike, and it totally, some of the complexities that I was finding so difficult to articulate or comprehend, I bring it to them, and then we discuss it together, and they help me to break those things down, and I think it helped me to understand the complexity or the nuance within the Canadian society. And then when kids play together, they support one another. They build that connections. They build that relationship as well. And by that, they may be able to help them adjust, integrate into the school and into the community. I hope.
I read a study where they had followed kids who went to a very multicultural school and had that sense of belonging in their classrooms, and then graduated and ran into the kinds of hiring barriers that we were talking about. And they said they felt disillusioned with Canada, that they had had this perception of Canada as this beautiful multicultural country where everyone belongs in their high school. And then running after jobs and running into barriers and barriers and barriers, thought maybe it's not as accepting of multiculturalism as they had been told in high school.
Right.
So I wonder, on maybe this is a question for you, Jackie, on a kind of policy level, maybe, but what can we do to support students after they've graduated? Or is that more where community partnerships come in? And I feel like there's a big
think
gap.
it's the same problem as when they graduate from university.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we have a big problem. I think, when I experienced it with hiring, that it's really hard to hire diversity. When we meet with candidates and they fit into our value system and they fit into our sense of what does it take to teach, it's much easier to say, oh, okay, I know that this person's going to be a good teacher.
Because they know how to play the game?
Well, and just because I think we communicate more easily, right? Like, I understand their answers. I understand, and I mean that on not a surface level, but a deeper level. I think it just makes it easier. And yet, when I look at what we need in our system, we need diversity in our system. And somehow we need to prioritize that it's diversity. But the hiring practices that we've used, I think, depends on those personal connections. And sometimes, like for a job interview, if you're going for a teaching interview, it's probably an hour interview or a 35-minute interview. And if you and I don't click, probably I'm not going to say I think Enver's the guy for the job. But those cultural pieces really sometimes need time to build connection, rather than that 35-minute space where we say, oh yeah, I get you. And I don't know how we get over that obstacle, but it's a problem, because I think we're even denying our organizations something that they dearly need, but we can't figure out how to get to that next spot.
Maybe I'll touch on that a little bit, Jackie, because I think it's not unique specifically to any specific industry or sector.
No, I don't think it is either. I just know education, so I know how it happens here, and I've experienced how it happens here. Even in trying to support the diverse candidate and saying, no, I think, this is a really good choice. It's really hard to argue that.
I have seen some commonality though, regardless of industry or sector. And I'll use one example. Maybe you guys have heard me use this example before, but maybe you haven't, so this is new. I think that some of the challenges I've seen, particularly as it comes to what you're talking about, is like this idea of building rapport, right, in an interview environment. There's things that we are doing as an organization, and there's lots more we can do. And it's to support that individual. It's really a sales and marketing exercise when you go for that job interview. But if you think about, if you were an educator, say you were a principal for 10 years, right, whether it be in Canada or your country of origin, and you arrive in Canada and it's a regulated profession, that there's a good chance you're not going to be a principal. But because that's your identity, you apply generally for those jobs. And And usually what happens, some version of this first question comes up in most interviews. And it's the first question, some version of it. And maybe, in post-secondary might be a little different, might be a little bit more professional, but it's some version of this. Tell us about yourself. And usually some version of this answer comes about. Back in my country, I was a principal for 10 years. Well, the rapport sometimes doesn't necessarily translate because I don't know what happened in your country if I've never been there. And I don't know what principals do, if it's the same or not. And so if we could find, ways to support the applicant to position themselves in a way that allows for that connection. And, the principal one is a little bit unique because it is a regulated profession, right? But if you apply that to maybe HR as an example, HR is a very culturally distinct profession. HR in Canada is different from HR in another country. So if you could articulate your strengths in that interview, you've got administration experience, you've got project management experience, and a whole range of skills and experiences that could benefit the employer, they're more likely to see that connection. And so there's work that we undertaking to try and help. I use the term repackaging, to help individuals repackage the experience for the Canadian context. And then on the flip side, we also want to work with hiring managers as well, right? And the challenge that a lot of immigrants have, and I know we've gone through challenges, and as I said, there's many of them, but one of them is that if you coming into Canada as an international experienced professional, fluent in one of the two official languages, you've had a previous career, you've got formal education, there's a good chance you're not going to struggle to find a job. But in most cases, and we've seen this with international students after graduation, we've seen this with international experienced professionals coming in through economic class, usually that first job ends up being, for lack of a better term, a survival job. And it's not to imply that they're not happy, it's not to imply that they're doing well at their job, but it may not be where they want it to be. And even if a better job came up 6 months later, because there's uncertainty of going into probation, you may stay in that survival job a lot longer than you anticipated, especially if you've got kids to feed and rent to pay. 2 years goes by and you suddenly, maybe you've done some studies, maybe you've got that international credentials recognized here in Canada, and now you apply to schools or you apply to the education sector. And you're thinking, okay, I'd like to now get into the education sector. Hiring managers don't know why you've worked in those survival jobs for 2 years. And so what ends up happening is they discount all previous experience, thinking, well, maybe they just wasn't good at the job. And so there's things that we want to do to support hiring managers in navigating international experience and maybe even articulating those questions differently. And that's where I think, and again, these are, I will say, these are opinions at this stage, substantiated opinions, but still opinions nonetheless. But I think that's where the work that IDEGI is going to be doing is going to help support this, because this is not unique to any particular sector or industry. I was speaking to someone who went through the expense of getting their engineering credentials recognized in Canada. I even spoke to someone who was a lawyer. And I spoke to someone who even went back, who had incredible HR experience, who went back to school to get an HR Canadian education. And the challenges all three of them facing is the same, is that in many cases, the experience has been discounted. And then there's the networking side, right? How do we build networks? And I think for us as being sort of the boots on the ground, developing the programs, developing the services, we can support, we can be the bridge to allow them to build those valuable networks, at every stage of their journey, so that we're not just waiting for them to get to employment and then suddenly like, okay, how do we create a job fair and bring you together? Well, if you haven't built your ability to talk about the weather in Canada, which is a very topical small talk conversation, especially now that we're in winter. If you haven't built that kind of confidence, then we're also not setting you up for success. So there's a lot that we can do on both sides, and I think that's kind of where we need to really position ourselves, because there's some commonality in a lot of the challenges. But again, we're really excited to see what the research brings about, because I'm sure there's some things that we maybe haven't even thought of that we should be.
Mhm. So we've talked about how Brandon isn't unique in terms of like labor shortages and in terms of some of the challenges being faced, but are there unique things that Brandon has, maybe because of context, maybe because of size? I don't know. Are there areas where Brandon has unique opportunities for settlement? Maybe I'll direct that to you, Enver.
Yeah, I'm extremely optimistic about Brandon's ability to navigate things. And it's not just because I live here, but I've lived in lived and worked in 4 provinces, 4 countries and 3 continents. And I think what makes Brandon unique, if you've been in Manitoba or you've lived in Winnipeg, but you maybe come from another province, like maybe Ontario, when you move to Winnipeg, everybody says Winnipeg is 1 degree of separation, right? Like it's very easy to get connected. I'd say Brandon is like half a degree of separation. And so it's through that half a degree of separation that if we are looking to get more coordinated, if we're looking to go from idea to execution, if we're looking to ensure that we can bring a voice to those that don't have a voice, I think it's a lot easier in this environment, because there are lots of well-intentioned organizations and leaders and individuals at that grassroots level that's all looking and playing a role in this type of dialogue. But I think what we don't currently have is coordination. And I think given Brandon's that half a degree of separation, I think whether it's coordination through a project like what IDEG is doing and WIS and BUK is in partnership, coordinating the conversation and then seeing how we can move that work forward in the community, or even institutional coordination, where we no longer saying it's not my role, but more saying it is our role. Maybe we don't honestly all have to play the same part right now, but it's our role. And then I think the last part is that we need leadership to step forward, and leadership at all levels. And it doesn't mean everybody necessarily has to hold the baton all the time. They can pass the baton along the way. And I think that in Brandon right now, there's the right climate for all of that to exist. And then obviously, just a little shout out to your podcast. We need more of these conversations to happen. And I think that, given Brandon's size, but also access, right? So, a lot of what's happening here isn't happening in isolation. I think there's, we have academics, we have 3 academic centers here doing amazing work, well connected with researchers, across the country. So I think we're also able to bring in some of the best practices and research from other communities to try and help inform what's happening here. So we don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel as well. So I'm really optimistic. I think that given Brandon's local context, I think there's a lot that can be done.
Thanks. That's the 3rd time in a row on this podcast that we've heard something similar. Hey, like
I know.
we had Huddle and we had BNRC and now WIS all saying we need that kind of collaborative model with interagency collaboration, and Brandon is uniquely positioned to do that. Those pretty powerful statements, one right after the other like that. So you're not the only one arguing for that or putting that forward.
Yeah, I was thinking exactly the same
Yeah,
thing.
it's
I was
striking.
thinking about, so how does that happen?
Yeah.
Because we also talked to 3 groups that I don't think are necessarily collaborating.
Yeah.
But they're open to collaboration, which is the first step.
Yeah, and I think with reference to the groups, I mean, there is collaboration. I think there's also mandates as well. And so, and this comes back to that institutional challenge that we have, because even if we have 2 post-secondary institutions in the community, both bringing in international students now, can you collaborate, or is just the very nature of the way the funding is set up and the organizational independence is set up? Is there an opportunity to collaborate? And so part of this curiosity is are the systems set up to support collaboration? Because even if you look at within the nonprofit sector, funding is competitive, just the very nature of it, right? And so are the systems set up to support collaboration, or are the systems set up to, but it doesn't mean collaboration isn't happening, but at what level, right? And so it's an interesting question, and I don't have the answer, but what I can say confidently is that there is collaboration, but we need more of it.
Yeah.
That's sort of the answer that we heard before as well. Was that there was a lot of sort of on the ground collaboration.
Like someone walking a client over next door to the next door office because they needed the services over there, right? Which is, I think, the strengths of Brandon that you're describing. Yeah. Well, thank you to all of you. Are there any other final things that anyone wants to add? No.
I might talk a little bit about just hopefully this is the beginning of more beginnings, because from a research perspective, obviously, research is published, and then we kind of like, we all celebrate, and it goes on a website somewhere, and the report goes in the drawer, and good work, but I think this kind of academic practitioner relationships is really important, and whether it be with WIS and and BU Cares, or whether it be with other organizations out there, I think more of this is needed. And if there's an opportunity for more, even if because maybe that's what the model looks like from in terms of what the new system should be, right? Is more of this kind of relationships, because it does provide that community engagement, but it also ensures that the trust that's built in that community engagement is followed through by those on the ground. So we're not just bringing individuals together and saying, okay, tell us what you think. Let's do a survey, or let's a focus group, and then the work goes nowhere, right? And I think that more of this excites me, and hopefully wherever BU Cares kind of puts focus on, more of this continues, with support from funders out there, and whether there's other institutions that need to come to play, because from an immigration perspective, we know, and I think, thanks for that statistics, 1.5 million by 2025. This has been the largest undertaking of population growth through immigration ever. And if, from a community economic development perspective, which we've all touched on, we need population growth to support the infrastructure that we all greatly depend on. Right. So the timing is really key, and we shifting from immigrants and newcomers, we really need everyone to be successful, because again, immigrants and newcomers don't live in a vacuum. So we can't just be looking at this through the lens of immigrants and newcomers exclusively, because some of the wicked problems that exist in our community impacts everyone. Right. And when we think about welcoming communities, what happens if you move here and you have kids? Are they now Canadian and you the immigrant? And the problems that, so we really need to think about this more broadly and holistically, and maybe bring others to the table. Another research project for you, perhaps?
We will talk.
Okay.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much to both of you. And we appreciate your time and your expertise.